Hello Revolution students and welcome back. In this video I am going to review the 2024 History Revolutions End of Year exam. I am going to look at both the Russian and Chinese revolutions sections of the exam because they are the revolutions that I teach my students. But the advice and the various things we're going to talk about will still be relevant if you study the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So let us get into it. As usual, I've got my question and answer book on this side of the screen, and I've got the sources booklet on this side of the screen, and we're going to scroll through and compare as we go through. So the first thing, once again, is to look at how the exam is structured in the sense of the time allocated that you have for answering various questions and so forth. So the first thing is reading time. So you've got 15 minutes reading time, and the first thing you do with your 15 minutes reading time is you use it effectively. You use that reading time to have a look at the various questions, you read your sources, you analyse the images that the examiners have provided to you, and you start thinking about the answers that you're going to write down for the various questions. So the first thing is I look at the contents page of my question and answer book, and I look at the contents page of my sources book, and I go straight to the relevant pages without wasting time. And the other thing I do, even before I do that, is I think about how much time I should allocate to each section. So in section A, and we can see down here, section A is our source analysis section, and section B is the section on the essays. So you have to do in section A the source analysis questions for your first revolution, your A revolution, and then you have to also complete the source analysis questions for your second revolution. So for my students, we do the Russian source analysis questions and we do the Chinese revolution source analysis questions. And then, so that is in section A, and then in section B, we have the essay, and we get our choice about doing either the essay on Russia or China revolution. For section A, if we break it down, it's worth 50 marks. Section A, 25 marks for your first revolution, 25 marks for your second revolution for the source analysis questions, and then the essay is worth 20 marks. We have 2 hours writing time. If we work that out and break that down in relation to how much each mark is worth in writing time, it's roughly, this is very exact, about 1.7 minutes per mark. Now, if we extrapolate that out, what that means for section A, your first revolution, the source analysis questions, and for me, it's going to be and my students, it's going to be the Russian Revolution, which is worth 25 marks. They are going to spend in section A for the first revolution's source analysis questions, 42.5 minutes, roughly. And then that same amount of time, 42.5 minutes for the source analysis questions on the Chinese Revolution, which leaves me approximately 35 minutes for section B for the essay. Now, that's a rough estimate. That is a guide. Some of the questions, and we're going to look at how much time you should allocate to each of the questions once we get into it. Some of the questions you'll be able to answer a lot quicker, and you'll be able to use the time that you save, which should have been allocated to those, for example, those shorter 2-mark questions or whatever. They can be answered very quickly. You can then use that time you've saved in answering those questions to either add more time to your essay, so spend a bit more time, add a few minutes here or there to the 35 minutes that you usually have for the writing the essay, or you could allocate that time to your 10 or 9-mark questions, which are very, very important. They're the ones that really differentiate our students, the good students from the not as good students. So let us get into it anyway. So let's look at section A, and I'm going to go to the Russian Revolution. So I'm going to turn over the page, and I'll just hit here, and I'll turn over, I ignore that, Go next, go up. All right, so here we are, the instructions. I've got question 3 for the Russian Revolution, which is on page 12, and then question 4 for the Chinese Revolution, which is on page 16. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, I'm not doing those, so I don't even look at those questions. I ignore them, so I'm going to go straight to the Russian Revolution. If I looked at these questions and these revolutions just for something to do, well, I'm wasting my time, and I'm not going to get the marks that I fully deserve. So I'm going to go straight to the Russian Revolution in my question and answer book. So page 12, let's see, down. I'm ignoring all the American stuff. Don't need that. Don't need the French stuff. Don't need the French stuff. And here we are, the Russian Revolution, page 12. I'm happy here. So I'm also going to then go to the corresponding sources section for the Russian Revolution in my sources book. And I'm going to go to page 8 here. So let's go. Bang, 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 bang. Interesting. All right. So here is my sources here. On my first source, source 9, very rich source. And then if I just quickly skip through, source 10, a letter from the Tsarina. Source 11 is a historical interpretation from Smith. Good. And then source 12 is another historical interpretation from Service on Lenin. Okay, so they're my sources there. I'll go back to the cartoon here. Good. So this is what we're talking about here. We've got these 2-mark questions for the Russian Revolution. A, identify 2 visual features of source 9 that show that Tsar Nicholas II feared opposition to his government. And here is the image here, and it's a very rich image. So there were lots of different features that would satisfy the requirements of this question. If we are working out the amount of time we should devote to this question, it's 2 marks, and we think back, it's generally about 1.7 minutes, or 1.7 minutes per mark. That pretty much rounds up to 3.5 minutes for these 2-mark questions to complete this. It shouldn't take you 3.5 minutes to answer this question, particularly since you've had your reading time, you've looked at this question, you've looked at the corresponding image here. There's lots of easy answers here, and you go straight in, bang, bang. Now this can be dot points. So dot point, and then refer to identify a feature. Dot point, identify your second visual feature. The question is only asking you to identify 2 visual features, so that is what you do. You do not identify 3 visual features because you are wasting your time. You're only going to get a maximum of 2 marks. You should be able to do that within a minute or something like that, which means you've got 2.5 minutes up your sleeve, which you can then use for some of these later longer questions, the 10-marker, which is we'll have a look at later. So that is question A. Little thing, just something to note about this image. On the exam itself, it has been fixed up here, but on the exam, I believe the text down here, you can see the caption, it's been translated. The word aristocracy is there, and you can see on the step there that says aristocracy. So we have tyranny, despotism, and aristocracy. In the exam, the original exam, it's been edited now, that actually said autocracy. The text on the 3 steps reads autocracy. That was an error, but whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's not going to change things that much. So you just deal with that. That's not a big deal. So let's have a look at answering these questions. So the first question asks, identify 2 visual features of source 9 that show that Tsar Nicholas II feared opposition to his government. So visual features. These can be the bomb with the word Duma written on it. The bomb itself, the Duma is going to explode the autocracy. And then you've got anarchy, another bomb on here, another visual feature. You've got these, they look like sailors here. You could refer to them. You could refer to the Tsar and the way he's looking. He's looking quite fearful of his smelling the smoke. So they're visual features as well. The steps themselves with the words written on them, those steps are visual features too. So they're things that you could answer for question A. Question B, identify 2 written features. And once again, we've got lots of writing on here. We've got the caption here. The Tsar I smell something burning, alluding to just about the bombs to explode. The word Duma written on this bomb here. The word anarchy written on this bomb here. The words written on the steps as well. So they would all satisfy, references to those would satisfy this question B. Let us go to source 10 now. So, using source 10 and your own knowledge, explain how Tsarina Alexandra contributed to the outbreak of the February Revolution. So I'm going to turn over my source booklet to the appropriate source and page. And here it is here. And this is what we looked at before. A letter from Tsarina Alexandra to Tsar Nicholas II, dated 22nd of August 1915, on the day that Nicholas appointed himself commander of the Russian army, commander-in-chief of the Russian army. He goes to the front for from about now right up until the February Revolution. For most of the time, he comes back occasionally back to Petrograd, but he pretty much leaves the control of the civilian government in the hands of the Tsarina and her friend Rasputin. So here is a written source. Here, using source 10 in your own knowledge, explain how Tsarina Alexandra contributed to the outbreak of the February Revolution. In order to get your full 5 marks for this response, you need to refer to source 10, and you are going to use an exact quote from this source, at least one, and also you're going to include your own knowledge. Now, this number of lines here, let's turn over the page, and we've got 1, 2, 3 lines there. You should be writing at least 125 words for this. If you wrote more, you'd get to the end of your response here, or where you got up to here, and then you'd say, look in extra space or whatever at the end of the exam. Booklet, written booklet, so that the examiner would know, or PTO, and just make sure that you identify that the extra stuff that you've written all the way down here. We keep going down in the extra space stuff part here. This is where you'd say, we'll refer to question 3. See continued. We'll go back. Back. And you should be writing about 125 words, but you could be writing more. The key is the amount of time that you have to respond to this 5-mark question, and you should be spending around 8.5 minutes, okay, in responding to the 5-mark question. You may have saved some time in responding to your 2-mark question here and your 2-mark question here, which you could add a little bit more time here to answer this. I personally would be spending more time answering the 10-mark question here. Any extra time that you have, I would spend on answering this 10-mark question. If we go back, we skipped over a little bit. That 10-mark question there, the London question, or any extra time that I've saved, I would spend devote that to writing an extra awesome essay. But anyway, getting back to this, so 125 words, you got to refer to the source. You have to quote the source at least once, and you have to include your own knowledge as well. You start with a contention. Explain how Tsarina Alexandra contributed to the outbreak of the February Revolution. A contention such as, Tsarina Alexandra contributed to the outbreak of the February Revolution by undermining the authority of the Tsar. That could be a response, okay? Points from your own knowledge that you could include in here. There are lots of different things you could refer to. In this letter, and we'll read a little bit, the Tsarina is referring to, or telling the Tsar not to be fearful. Do not fear, God will give me the strength to help you. We see that the struggle here really is and means you showing your mastery, proving yourself the autocrat without which Russia cannot exist. So, autocrat in the sense that you're also the leader of the army and that you're going to be an awesome leader. And don't worry, I and my friend Rasputin believe you're going to do really well, but also that we're going to actually, we'll take care of the government too while you're away. Make them tremble before your courage and will. God is with you, and our friend Gregory Rasputin, for you. All is well. Don't doubt. Believe, and all will be well. And the army is everything. A few strikes, nothing in comparison, as they can and shall be suppressed. And this is interesting, her reference to some strikes, the people perhaps striking in response in Petrograd and Moscow and other places to the problems caused by the war. We do know, once we get into February 1917, and we have various strikes occurring in the lead up or to the overthrow of the Tsar and his regime, yes, those strikes do get out of hand. So when we're referring to, it's a very rich source. There's lots of different quotes you could refer to here, explaining how the Tsarina has contributed to the revolution. One thing you've got to be careful of is that you don't quote the source too much and spend all your time quoting the source and then not having enough time to include points from your own knowledge. Ideally, you'd want at least 2 points from your own knowledge in this response. Maybe just some statistics, some primary source quotes, etc. Now, a very popular quote that was used in the responses to this question, there's that very famous quote from the Tsarina where she's written to the Tsar on the 25th of February 1917, and she's referring to the strikes that are going on in Petrograd, and she refers to the strikes or the protesters as a hooligan movement. And she pretty much blames the Duma for rousing up the people. And she says if the Duma just stopped, rousing up the people, then everything would be under control again. However, that doesn't happen, and everything, the Tsar, as we know, does get overthrown. So you could have used that quote. You could have spoken about or referred to her relationship with Rasputin. You could have referred to the ministerial leapfrogging that was going on during her control of the civilian government in Petrograd, when there were, and here's your nice stat, 4 prime ministers from 1915 up to 1916. She swapped and changed those prime ministers under the advice of Rasputin. So there was actually a lot of different points you could have made in this question, question C, from your own knowledge. What we found though, when we were, because I did do exam marking last year, a lot of students spent too much time just quoting from source 10, from this very rich source, and did not include enough of their own knowledge. If you don't include enough, any of your own knowledge in your response here for question C, the highest mark you're going to get is 3 out of 5, okay? It's when you start including points from your own knowledge, which you then increase your mark up to 4 or up to 5. So your own knowledge, that's really, really key. And please make sure that you cite source 10. So you either put something along the lines of, write something along the lines of according to source 10, or you put open bracket, source 10, close bracket, behind a quote from the source, an exact quote, or you can or you could do open bracket S10, okay, close bracket, after the exact quote from this source. All right, all are accepted, but you got to make sure you quote the source and you add your own knowledge. All right, let's move on. Question D, a 6-mark question. So for a 6-mark question, you should be spending about 10 minutes, okay, for this 6-mark question. And you've got all of these lines. You could keep writing down here. Make sure that you write within this space. So don't go over too much over here and don't go too much over here. They have got here in the question and answer book where it says do not write in this area, because I remind you, all of these exam papers get scanned. If you write in this area, for example, it will not go in the scan. And even here, you have to be careful. So make sure you try to write over the lines, you could certainly write down here. And if you just want to be really safe, you just go to the end of the examination booklet and in the extra writing space part, and then you just write your extra answer in there, your extra words for question D here. But anyway, so this is a 6-mark question. You are spending 10 minutes on this. You should be writing at least 150 words for this question here. And we've got source 11 here. And the question asks, using source 11 and your own knowledge, analyse how the lives of women were changed by the October Revolution up to 1927. The source itself, it is historical interpretation from Smith. The Bolsheviks came to power with a radical program for the liberation of women and the radical transformation of the family. The Code of Marriage and Family in October 1918 equalised women's legal status with men's, allowed both spouses to retain the right to their own property and earnings, and made divorce available at the request of either party. Under the old regime, the church had granted divorce in only the rarest of circumstances. So, once again, we have a really, really rich source. Many of you would have come in, many students would have come in if they had a question about, in preparation, their own knowledge might have included information about the marriage code. So a little bit of a difficulty with this response is that the source already refers to the marriage code, which means there goes some of your own knowledge out the door. You can't really use points about the marriage code unless you've got extra information about the marriage code which isn't included in the source. But on the positive side of things, you can use your reference in source 11. You're obviously going to refer to the marriage code, okay? So once again, you have to have at least one reference to the source. You could have 2, plus at least 2 or 3 points from your own knowledge about how lives of women were changed. Various things you could talk about. You could talk about the lives of peasant women. You could talk about the lives of working women. You could talk about how their lives were changed by decrees such as the Decree on Land, which recognised the peasant land seizures. You could talk about the Decree on Workers' Control, which for a little time, anyway, before some of the harsher economic policies such as war communism came in, were imposed by the Bolsheviks upon the Russian people. You could talk about some of the positive things. You could talk about, obviously, you've got the Civil War, which was very, very harmful to the lives of women. You could talk about how many of them died as a consequence of the famine. 5 million people during the Civil War died because of famine. Around half of those would have been women. You could have also talked about that government department which was set up by the Bolsheviks, Zenitdel, to promote the rights of women in Russia. You could talk about the increased literacy that occurred as a consequence of the various education policies that were put in place by the Bolsheviks during this time. You could also have talked about the role of the role models that Bolshevik leaders like Alexandra Kollontai were excellent role models for female leaders, which other women in Russia could look up to and strengthen their positions within Russian society. So there are lots of points you could have made from your own knowledge here. But yes, once again, you're just going to make sure that you have, you just don't write about the source. Include your own knowledge as well. And once again, the highest mark you're going to get, probably 3 out of 6 if you just write about the source. Okay, let us keep going. So, question E, and this is your 10 marker. Let's have a look here. We'll turn over the page and we evaluate the extent to which Lenin's leadership enabled the survival of the new regime from the 26th of October 1917 to January 1924. There is a key period there up until when he dies. And then this question, and this isn't always the case. Sometimes these 10-mark questions or the 9-mark questions will not ask you to refer to a source. They will just ask you to use your own knowledge. This one is asking you to refer to the source, which is source 12. So let's go to source 12. And here it is here. And we looked at this before, a historical interpretation of the leadership of Lenin, published in 2010. It is from Robert Service. So you've got to refer to source 12, at least one reference in source 12 in your response to this 10-mark question, plus a whole lot of your own knowledge. Now, the timing, how much time would you have to respond to this 10-mark question? This is one of the differentiator questions. This is where the strong students get their good marks and rise themselves or improve their overall marks in this exam compared to those students who don't do so well. So this is where you get a chance to really show your knowledge. You should spend at least 17 minutes on this response. Ideally, as we spoke about before, you've saved up some time from your writing your answers to question A and question B in this section, and you've got a little bit of extra time. So if you usually had about 17 minutes, you might have, if you've saved some time, maybe 20 minutes to respond to this question. You should be writing about 250 words minimum. With 20 minutes, you can zip that out to say 300 words, if not more. So how much room have we got in the examination paper to write your response? Let's have a look. We've got more room here. You can write down there as well. And if you wish to, then you can, if you're still writing and you need more room, then you go to the back of the examination, the question and answer booklet, and you write in that extra space as we have spoken about before. Now, this is an evaluate question. Evaluate the extent to which Lenin's leadership enabled the survival of the new regime. So this is a judgment question. You have to make a judgment about how significant Lenin's leadership was in achieving, in enabling the Bolsheviks to maintain their authority in Russia after the October Revolution. And you can say, you'd start with a contention, and you can argue that Lenin's leadership was very, very significant in enabling the survival of the new regime from the 26th of October up to 26th of October 1917 up to January 1924. Or you could say it wasn't very significant, or you could say it was significant, however, there are other factors involved as well. The key thing here is that you do have to refer to Lenin's leadership. Now, you might only spend 1 or 2 points referring to his leadership. You can certainly, this source is all about Lenin. So, once again, there's a lot of information here about Lenin and some policies here too. So, we've got Lenin was an exceptional figure. He founded the Bolsheviks, which he turned into a party that made the October Revolution of 1917. The world's first socialist state survived against the odds. Lenin and the communist leadership withdrew Russia from the First World War and won the Civil War. So straight away, there's lots of just, signposts about things that you can refer to. There's passing references to the First World War and withdrawing from the First World War. So you could, in your own knowledge, even though there's a reference here, you could quote this statement, withdraw Russia from the First World War. So you can say that's my reference to source 12. And then you can refer to, for example, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and Lenin's role in signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans in March 1918. And then you could expand upon that and you could talk about how many Bolsheviks didn't agree with it. It was a test of Lenin's leadership, and he certainly got the Bolsheviks to vote, the leadership to vote for it, but just You could talk about consequences such as the rupture that occurred between the left SRs and the Bolsheviks after the signing of this treaty. If we keep going on, the First World War, then there's this reference to won the Civil War. So you could quote this part here of this source, won the Civil War, and then you could have another various points, so much to write about the Civil War and Lenin's, and particularly you could talk about Trotsky then, and Trotsky's role. And that is not Lenin, so you could say, well, you know, your view might be that yes, Lenin's leadership was significant. However, Trotsky played just as a significant role in maintaining Bolshevik leadership through his leadership in the Civil War, through Trotsky's reorganization, for example, of the Red Army when he reintroduced strict discipline, when he reintroduced ranks, and when he transformed the Red Army into, by the end of the Civil War, a 3 million strong Red Army force. So they're the things you could talk about. So once again, I come back to again, in the last year's exam, 2024, the sources were very rich, which is great, but you can go to sort of, as a student, you can get sucked into just talking about the sources. Pull back. You don't need to spend 250 words just quoting this. Cite a few quotes here or there and then use that as a springboard to show the examiners your own knowledge, to include your own knowledge, quotes and so forth here. Then we've got in 1921, Lenin, introduced a new economic policy and saved the Soviet state from being overwhelmed by popular rebellion. Oh, this is a rich source. Popular rebellion. Various rebellions and revolts going on by 1921, the most famous being the let me get my words right, the Kronstadt Uprising, the Kronstadt Sailors, and that revolt, that insurrection, Lenin, the very famous quote from Lenin where he refers to that revolt like a lightning flash, lighting up reality for him. It is a key reason why he put an end to war communism and introduced a new economic policy, because that was the most famous and the most significant of the revolts that went on at this time. We also had the workers' opposition led by Alexandra Kollontai criticising some of the Bolshevik policies. We also had other peasant uprisings. You had the Tambov revolt going on at this time as well. So a lot of different stuff going on, which forces Lenin to pull back the policies related to war communism, particularly that grain requisitioning policy, which was introduced right back in May 1918 to fight the Civil War, to feed the Red Army, where grain was forcibly taken from the peasants, introduced with that that decree on food procurement in May 1918. All these things that you can refer to. Lots of different stuff. It goes on. The source keeps going on. Lenin created the Cheka. Lenin justified dictatorship and terror. So, once again, lots of different things here. You could talk about the Cheka, their role in the Red Terror, Lenin's support for the Red Terror, the different aspects of the Red Terror, the economic aspects, war communism being an economic aspect of the Red Terror, the political aspects of the Red Terror, the attacking of class enemies, the assassinating of leaders who were seen as enemies of the state or whatever. Probably the best example of that being the Tsar and his family in July 1918. So there's lots and lots of stuff here that you could refer to. And then apart from writing all about this and making sure, even if you disagree that Lenin played a significant role in enabling the new regime to survive, you still got to spend a little bit of time at the start of your response or somewhere in there, at least 50 words, at least a quarter of your response referring to his leadership. And then if you believe it's not that significant, once you've said this is what he did, then you can say, however, it wasn't as significant as other policies or events or whatever, the role of Trotsky. You should also include, if you can, I would anyway, I'd include some supporting historical interpretations in here, separate to services. So some points from Pepys, Fish, others as well. Lots of different historians you could use in here. Thinking back, certainly you should be using historical interpretations in the essay. The old rule was that in the essay section, anyway, if you wrote an awesome essay but you didn't include historical interpretations, then the maximum score you could get would be 80% out of 100. So you're hitting like a glass ceiling. And it's when you included your historical interpretations from your own knowledge that you broke through that glass ceiling and you got the higher marks above 80, your 90s and your 95s and so forth. I would argue your 10-mark question is a similar case, okay? I would include a couple of historical interpretations, pepper them through your response here. Even if it's not necessarily a necessary thing, it's still your own knowledge. It still shows your own knowledge of the revolution. So let's stop talking about our Russian source analysis questions. Let's get on to China now. So I'm going to go over onto page 15 and I'll keep going on to here. And here is China. Let us go in our source booklet and get to the corresponding Chinese sources. So, just like in, and I'm not going to spend as much time breaking down the timing and all that as I did within Russia because it is exactly the same for China. The good thing about the way our examiners are writing these exams now is that they try as much as possible to have similar style questions in all the exams. So we've seen with the Russian Revolution that question A and question B, they were identify questions and they were 2-mark questions as well, and they both referred to a visual. So it's the same with China as well. So we've got a very rich visual source here, and the visual, the questions are asking you firstly to refer to written features and then visual features. I think if we go back, I think it was visual features first for the Russian source and then written features, but it's exactly the same. They're both 2-mark questions. They're both asking you to identify. They're both, once again, asking you for only 2 points. 2 here, 2 here. So that is all that you include. You don't include 3 because you're wasting your time. Just make sure that you're that they are correct, that your points are correct. We have translations here, and the same with Russia, China. Often, particularly with the Chinese, but same with the Russian sources. Chinese sources, they'll have captions in Mandarin, written in the Mandarin script, and more often than not, the examiners, if they want you to refer to these captions, they'll give you the translation, okay? You don't need to know Mandarin. If, for example, if there is a case where there is written script in here, Mandarin, written in Mandarin characters, and there is no translation, then the examiners do not expect you to be able to read it. So your answers, you don't need to respond, okay, to that. But we do have some translations here. So source 13, this poster, published around 1937, circa 1937, includes the title, Love and Protect the Common People, Help the Common People. It was produced by the Red Army forces in southern China. Take note of the date here, 1937. We have around 1937. It might be before the Japanese invasion, full-blown invasion, which starts in July 1937, the Japanese invasion of China. It might be after. We don't know. So don't assume anything. So that's something you have to be careful of here. But I would probably guess it probably is the case. And we've got translations here. The text down the left-hand side of the image here translates as produced by the political department of the High Command of the 4th Military Region. So that is there, that text. And then the title, this must be the title here. love and protect the common people. Good. All right. So what we start with, identify 2 written features. So we're going to be referring to these characters here, which we have the translations. So that's what we would have here. And then 2 visual features. That's when we're looking 2 main things. We've got a Red Army soldier helping an injured peasant. There. Bandaging up peasant. His arm, he's hurt his arm. And then in the background, we've got another Red Army soldier helping a peasant plant rice in a rice paddy. So there's 2 points straight there. Okay, we don't need to use our own knowledge. It doesn't ask. Question B does not ask to use our own knowledge, so we don't need to. We don't need to refer to something like the mass line or anything like that. I'm sure there'll be opportunities later on to refer to that sort of stuff if we wish to. All we need to do is refer to identify the Red Army soldier. Your first point can be here, Red Army soldier helping the injured peasant in the foreground of the image, if you wish to refer to that. And then your second point, in the background, the Red Army soldier helping the peasant plant rice. Okay, tick, tick, there's your 2 marks. And once again, you're spending about 3.5 minutes on A, 3.5 minutes on B. But as we can see, this isn't too hard to respond to, quite easy. So it's not going to take you 3.5 minutes to answer question A. It's not going to take you 3.5 minutes to answer question B because you already know your answers. You've already figured those out in the reading time. So it might take you a minute to write that, a minute to write that. That means you've got, rather than 7 minutes here, it's only taking you 2 minutes, so you've got 5 minutes up your sleeve, and you can use that to answer some of these other questions which get you the higher marks. Using source 14 and your own knowledge, explain why the Kuomintang lost the Civil War. So let's turn over the page here to source 14. Just take note, the examiners have put, here's the pinyin, Kuomintang. That's how Kuomintang is written in pinyin. And then this is the Wade-Giles, the old transcription or translation. That's how it used to be written in Latin script in English. That's how we used to translate it many, many decades ago. More often than not, you're going to get the pinyin, but sometimes, particularly when we've got old sources, and if they're going back to, say, 1960s, 1970s, you might have a lot of the Chinese words written in the Wade-Giles, other Mao Zedong. Yeah, right. Mao's still written the same, but then you got the TSE on there rather than Mao Zedong. So the main thing for you, I would advise, even if you've got a reference to something in Wade-Giles, use the Wade-Giles translation is used in a source or whatever, you can just write it in the pinyin if you find that easier. If you do, for some reason, decide to use the Wade-Giles, just be consistent in your response. It's just annoying. Don't flip between pinyin and Wade-Giles, okay? Don't write Beijing or Beiping, Beijing, 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 and then decide to then write Peking, for example, which is the old Wade-Giles translation of Beijing. Be consistent. All right, so a 5-mark question. You've got 8.5 minutes to write your response to this question. If we go over the page, yes, we've got a few lines over here. So 1, 2, 3 lines. You're writing about 125 to 150 words minimum on this. Once again, the key is the amount of time you spend. If you're a fast writer and you've got 8.5 minutes and you can write 200 words in 8.5 minutes, you might say, yeah, let's just go for it. Let's write 200 words in 8.5 minutes. I reckon I can, and I'm going to have no problems answering all the other responses as well with the time I need. So then you're just sort of making sure that you get your 5 marks. Once again, you have to refer to the source at least once, and you have to include your own knowledge. Okay? So, the source, Michael Lynch, our friend Michael Lynch. After some seemingly impressive successes in the first year of the war, so we're talking about, the Civil War, yes, the nationalists, the Kuomintang, were unable to achieve a single major victory between 1947 and 1949. The question's asking, using source 14 in your own knowledge, explain why the Kuomintang lost the Civil War. Faced by growing desertions and betrayed by some of his higher officers who passed to the communists details of nationalist troop positions and movements, Jiang Jishe, could never wholly rely on his supposed supporters, a problem that rarely troubled Mao Zedong. Unable to sustain a genuinely popular following, Jiang increasingly resorted to coercion. So lots of things you can refer to here. Where it's alluding to coercion, forced conscriptions, for example, of peasants. And I remind you, so the GMD, they would go out into the countryside and forcibly conscript Chinese peasants into the Kuomintang army. And then no wonder when they started fighting the Red Army, many of these peasants deserted straight away to the communists. There are lots and lots of points you could include in here. All right, they shouldn't have a problem. So many things you could talk about why the Kuomintang lost the Civil War. We just referred to some. You could talk about Jiang Jishe's leadership. You could talk about corruption within the Kuomintang. You could talk about all the good things from the perspective of the peasants that the CCP did for them. So the big ones being redistribution of land, taking land from the landlords and giving that land to the poor peasants. This land problem, the Kuomintang never effectively resolved, even though it was a promise made by Sun Yat-sen, going right back and looking at his 3 principles. If you remember that third principle, the people's livelihood, and that very, very famous quote from Sun Yat-sen, or his aim of giving land to the tiller, giving land to the peasant, land redistribution, the land problem, the land exploitation, the unequal ownership of land in China was probably the biggest problem facing Chinese society, the one that the majority of the Chinese population wanted to be resolved. The Kuomintang, by this stage, never resolved the problem. Mao Zedong and the CCP certainly offered solutions to that. Okay, so let us keep going. Question D. Using source 15 and your own knowledge, analyse how the lives of peasants were changed by the revolution up to 1957. Ooh, this year, very, very important. And we've got here the source. There we've got the Wei Giles here. That's what I was talking about before. And I promise you I didn't see that when I was talking about it before. I was just looking up here. I promise. So, source 15. Extract from a speech given by Mao Zedong at the 11th session of the Supreme State Conference in February 1957. So, referring to source 15, lives of peasants, analyse how the lives of peasants were changed by the revolution up to 1957. So, it's an AOS2 question, so we're talking from 1959 up to 1957. This date here is very important because 57, this is the end of the 100 Flowers campaign and also that key economic policy, the first 5-year plan. From 1958 onwards, we have the introduction of the Great Leap Forward, when we have communes introduced and so forth. 58 up to 62, when we have the Great Famine and all the deaths that occur. But this question, just have a drink. This question is not asking you about the Great Leap Forward. It's asking you only up to 1957, which means if you write about the Great Leap Forward in your response to this question, you're not going to get any marks for any points you make about the Great Leap Forward. You're not going to get any marks about if you make references to the Cultural Revolution, because it is irrelevant for this question. So let's have a look. Extract from a speech given by Mao Zedong at the 11th session of the Supreme State Conference in February 1957. Because the imperialists oppressed and exploited us, ours is an impoverished country. And we've got some more difficult words. If you're finding them difficult, then the examiners have given some definitions here to help you. Country and the standard of living of our peasants is still low. In this context, it is right to say that the peasants lead a hard life. But in another sense, it is not true. As a matter of fact, with very few exceptions, there has been some improvement in the life of the peasants. This is interesting. Since liberation, October 1949, the peasants have been free from landlord exploitation and their production has increased annually. Take grain crops. In 1949, the country's output was only something over 210,000 million catties, and it's a unit of measurement, a unit of weight in China, with one catty being approximately 600 grams, so just over half a kilo. By 1956, it had risen to more than 360 million catties. The state agricultural tax is not heavy, only amounting to something over 30,000 million catties a year. A bit of context here. So this is during the first 5-year plan, and this is when cooperatives, collectives were introduced. And the context here is, from your study of the first 5-year plan, you would know that there was this debate within the CCP, particularly within the leadership, about whether collectives, cooperatives, and then they evolve eventually into communes, whether whether collectives were a better way of farming than individual land ownership, whether cooperatives, collectives, communes produced more grain than an individual farmer who owned his land, who farmed the land individually. What was the best form of farming for China to increase production? By the end of the first 5-year plan, and you would know this, annual agricultural production had only increased 2 to 3% per year during the first 5-year plan, from 53 up to 57. But the population was growing at a similar amount. So in the scheme of things, agricultural production hadn't really increased. Now, the debate within, and you'd know this as well, within the CCP leadership was it a problem with the whole system of collectivization? Mao's answer was, the reason why grain production and agricultural production had not increased as much as they had hoped was because collectivization hadn't been implemented strongly enough within China. Other CCP leaders like Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi, they argued the reason why agricultural production did not increase during this period, even though they'd had massive increases in, for example, heavy industry and manufacturing during this period in comparison to agricultural production. Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping said the reason why collectivization hadn't worked during this period was because the collectivization system was broken. It was better to just let peasants farm individually, to produce as much as they could, to sell their surplus grain to markets and enrich themselves. Okay? So you have this debate about whether collectivization was good or not, going and starting here in the first 5-year plan and then going right up to and including the Great Leap Forward, and even sort of going into the Cultural Revolution a bit as well. But we're not talking about that. We're just talking about, you're just discussing in this response the period up to 1957. So there's lots of points there that you could talk about that I just referred to in how the lives of peasants were impacted by the revolution up to 57. I haven't even spoken about, obviously the big point is the Agrarian Reform Law, which was introduced in June 1950. So that you would talk about there as well. Very, very important law where land was redistributed. I think 47% of land was redistributed as a consequence of that law in China at the time. It certainly benefited the peasants. For your landlords, they suffered. Becker has a stat about during the Fan Chen, 2 to 5 million landlords dying during those early years of land redistribution. But the question's not asking you about that. It's asking you about the peasants. So you could talk about the Agrarian Reform Law. You could talk about, obviously, the first 5-year plan, which we referred to. You would quote from here at least once or twice to satisfy that aspect of question D using source 15. And you use an exact quote, at least a sentence, please. Don't quote the whole thing. Just give us a nice punchy sentence from here. Other points you could make. You could refer to, if you wanted to, the marriage law, where peasant women were given the right to divorce their husbands for the first time. Okay, and it benefited them. So once again, lots of points you could make in answering this question. Just the key, making sure you don't write about anything after 1957, and that you don't just refer to the source, okay? But you include lots of your own knowledge. Okay, let's keep going. Let's move on. And once again, it's an evaluate question. Once again, it is asking you to refer to a source in the source book and booklet, and I'll turn over. A historical interpretation about the Cultural Revolution. From Fenby. Good. Evaluate the consequences of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution on Chinese society. Use source 16 and other evidence to support your response. Once again, when we're talking about a 10-mark question, you have at least 17 minutes to write this, but many of you might devote the time that you've spent in answering question A and B in this section that you've saved up, and you're going to use that now to answer this question. You might devote 20 minutes to answering this question. It's worth 10 marks, so it's worth at least half the marks you're going to get from the essay. The essay is worth 20 marks. This is worth 10 marks. So don't think this isn't important. It's just as important as the essay. If you think about your question E in China, 10 marks. Your question E in the Russian section, 10 marks. That is the same amount of marks as the essay. So devote the time that it deserves to responding to this question. So 10 marks, at least 17 minutes. You should be writing, I said before 250 words, I'll be going for 300 words, all right? With 20 minutes, you should be able to do that. You've got all of this space here, you've got this space here, you're going to zip down here, and then you can go right to the end of the writing booklet and use the extra space as well to respond to this. Evaluate the consequences of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution on Chinese society. So first up, you are just talking about the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. You're not talking about all those other significant events such as the 100 Flowers campaign, or the Great Leap Forward, or the first 5-year plan, or the Agrarian Reform Law, or the marriage law. Okay, you're just referring to the Cultural Revolution. If you're talking about struggle sessions, for example, as an aspect of the Cultural Revolution, you could go back to some of the earlier events just to show your knowledge, but you're only going to refer to those in passing. You could refer to how struggle sessions really began. If you wanted to be really, really fancy, go right back to AOS 1 during the Thought Rectification campaign when these struggle sessions were first introduced at Yan'an, but from February 1941 onwards. But really, you could just stay focused on AOS 2 as well. But you could briefly refer to the Thought Rectification campaign. Then you could refer to the Thought Reform campaign in 1951. Then you could refer to the 100 Flowers campaign just briefly. And then 100 Flowers Campaign, 56 to 57, and say, the struggle sessions occurred then, but they really occurred here, okay? They came to full fruition during the Cultural Revolution. So you could refer to how the impact upon intellectuals during the Cultural Revolution. So many different aspects of Chinese, so many different groups within China were impacted by the Cultural Revolution. Many groups we know suffered, so the intellectuals suffered, students suffered, even the Red Guards, who were all students, they suffered from the fact that they didn't go to school. You could refer to how schooling stopped. Lynch has some wonderful stats about how the number of universities were reduced during this time. You could refer to, lots of people suffered. You could refer also to how many people, some groups actually prospered, benefited during this time. And I'm referring to here the peasants who actually, many of them benefited because they didn't suffer during the Cultural Revolution as much, because a lot of the anarchy and the unrest that occurred in the cities. That's where most of the Red Guard activity occurred. You could talk about how it led to a split, how the CCP were purged during the Cleansing of the Ranks campaign. You could refer to how various female CCP leaders, the one, for example, the most famous being Zhang Qing, Mao's wife, rose to prominence, how they set examples of strong women for women in China in general. You could refer to Ni Yuanzi, that first of the Red Guards from Beijing, one of the early Red Guards, intellectuals at Beijing University, who was a big promoter of the Cultural Revolution and attacked rightists. Lots and lots of different things here that occurred. So you're not going to have any problem here. I would just say once again, though, that if you have the opportunity, I would refer to some historical interpretations, if you can, about the Cultural Revolution. And there are so many interpretations that historians have written about the Cultural Revolution. A lot of really good interpretations. I'm just going to read a few here for you. And both positive and negative. Philip Short, China had become a vast prison of the mind during the Cultural Revolution. We've got Femby, he writes, the sudden freedom to speak out against authority was intoxicating for students and Red Guards, for example. The whole aspect of the Cultural Revolution, whether it was actually a Cultural Revolution as such, or it was just a smokescreen that the leaders hid behind for a power struggle at the high echelons of the CCP leadership, a power struggle between Mao Zedong and Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping about who was going to control the CCP. That is a key aspect of the Cultural Revolution. Simon Leys writes, it was a power struggle fought at the top between a handful of men and behind the smokescreen of an invented mass movement. So lots of stuff you can refer to in this response about the Cultural Revolution. So this isn't a hard one. What it is, though, it is asking you to evaluate. So you're going to have to make a judgment about which of these consequences, and please use the key term consequence, a consequence, another consequence, a more significant consequence than this, a more significant consequence of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution than the struggle of leadership and Mao coming to power during this time. A more significant consequence was the impact upon the lives of intellectuals. Okay, you could talk about the Laogai and intellectuals being sent out to the Laogai being the labour camps, intellectuals being sent out to the labour camps to undertake hard labour. Lots of different things. But with an evaluation, you have to make a judgment. You have to sort of rank which consequences are more important than others. Anyway, lots of things you can write about here. Let us now get on to the essays. And I'm going to move over here. I'll go to here. Go here. All right, here's the essay section. So this is where the exam opens up a bit, and you can write about either your first revolution or your second revolution. These essays, they can ask you to write just about area of study 1 or area of study 2 or both. They can ask you to write about causes of a revolution or challenges, if it's an area of study 2 question, or if they're covering both area of study 2 and area of study 1 and area of study 2, that could be a continuity and change question about continuity and change about the lives of a specific social group or class within the society. So there is no strict rule here. You just need to make sure that you prepare well for these essays. You do have the choice though, and just need to make sure that you understand what areas of study the question is asking you about. The good thing though, for the past 3 or 4 years, when we have these essay questions, they tend to be based upon the same theme. So the Russian Revolution essay question will have a theme, and that will be mimicked in your second revolution. For me, my students, it's the Chinese Revolution. So, and you'll see they're mimicked also. They should be not popular movements here. That's a bit different, this American Revolution. But certainly in the French Revolution, we have a question about the spread of Enlightenment ideas. This question here, the Russian Revolution, is also an ideas question, and the Chinese Revolution question is also an ideas question because it talks about Maoism, Maoist ideology, Mao's interpretation of Marxism and how it is applied in China. So you get to choose 20 marks, 20 marks. You only do one essay. Make sure you only do one. You're not doing two. Make sure you're only doing one. And for the essay, you've got 35 minutes. Now, for your 35 minutes, you may have decided to, and we've saved, remember you saved up some time for writing your responses to those A-B questions very quickly. So you might have saved up an extra 5 minutes and you've decided, well, I'm actually going to use that extra 5 minutes on writing my essay, and I'm going to spend 40 minutes therefore in writing my essay for the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. The other key thing here to remember is that you don't have to answer the exam in sequence. You could decide to do the essay first in the first 40 minutes of the exam writing period, okay? And then that's what you feel better about, and then you're going to answer the sources later. So that's up to you. There could be a curly question in the sources, and one that you really can't get your head around, or you're having problems trying to think up some own knowledge about the Cultural Revolution, for example. Rather than spending 5 minutes just sitting there staring at the question and having no idea what to do, just leave it and then go back to it later. You might find when you start writing about the Chinese Revolution and Mao Zedong thought that suddenly all these things about the Cultural Revolution, which you'd forgotten, they might pop into your head, and you can quickly go back and start answering or finish your Chinese Revolution essay and then go back and do your question E about the Cultural Revolution. All of that is up to you. The main thing is that you use your time effectively and don't waste any of it. Okay, so the Russian Revolution. The influence of liberal ideas and reforms in Tsarist Russia made the outbreak of revolution certain to happen. The Chinese Revolution. The influence of Mao Zedong thought made the outbreak of revolution certain to happen. So these are AOS 1 questions, okay? Both of them are. Probably the French one is too, okay? 1789. So these are all AOS 1 questions. On next year's exam, this year, to the 2025 exam, it might be AOS 2 questions. You don't know. So you're just going to be prepared for whatever the examiners are going to throw at you. But when you read this, just make sure you're very clear about the time period that the essay question is asking you to write about. This is interesting. The influence of liberal ideas and reforms in Tsarist Russia made the outbreak of revolution certain to happen. Tsarist Russia. If you want to stick to the period of time Tsarist Russia occurred, we're talking 1896, the start of the Area of Study 1 for Russia, up to February 1917, when the Tsarist regime is overthrown. Would you argue that the provisional government from March 1917 is an aspect of Tsarist Russia? You might argue that some of the ideas of a constituent assembly, the establishment of a constituent assembly, a legislative parliament, were liberal ideas which failed to come to fruition properly within Tsarist Russia, but really then, even failed as well during the provisional government. The provisional government wasn't elected, I remind you, so and that impacted upon their legitimacy. So you could talk. This can be a little bit you got to be a little bit careful here, I would argue. But anyway, certainly you're going to have no problems writing about from 1896 up to February 1917, Tsarist Russia. Liberal ideas. You'd have to talk about this demand for the establishment of a constituent assembly or a legislative assembly, a parliament with lawmaking powers. And this goes right back to the October Manifesto, the Union of Unions, which Milyukov set up. That was one of the key demands of the Union of Unions. I think it was in May 1905, during the 1905 revolution. It was a demand that the establishment of a constituent assembly was a demand in Father Gapon's petition. When we had the Dumas eventually set up in April, and half a year prior to that with the Tsar's October Manifesto, when he promised to establish a legislative Duma, a Duma with lawmaking powers, and then he breaks that promise with, on the first day, I think it was, when the Duma opens and he issues his fundamental laws, which state that only the Tsar can approve laws, which means that the Dumas themselves have no legislative power, and that this dream of the Liberals to have a legislative parliament is broken, and which is a key contributing factor to the unrest that occurs between 1986 right up to February 1917 as well, a contributing factor. All of that you can talk about. So the influence of liberal ideas. And then the second part of the question here, the question also asks, to what extent do you agree? The influence of liberal ideas and reforms in Tsarist Russia made the outbreak of revolution certain to happen. This is an evaluation question. You have to either agree with it or not. If you believe that liberal ideas, such as this dream of a legislative Duma, legislative parliament, if you're going to argue it did not make the outbreak of revolution certain to happen, that's fine, but you still have to at least acknowledge, identify, talk about, at least devote at least a paragraph of your essay to liberal ideas. You can't just say liberal ideas and reforms did not make the outbreak of revolution certain to happen, and then go on to the impact of World War I. Or go on to the impact of the Tsar and the Tsarina's relationship with Rasputin as undermining their support within the aristocracy and for the Tsarist regime, and etc., etc. There are lots of other things that caused revolution as well, and you can talk about those, but you still have to identify spend at least a paragraph. Give us at least 100, 150 words of your knowledge about liberal ideas, and then why they weren't as important. You could pepper these points throughout your essay as well. You don't necessarily have to say, have one strict paragraph on talking about discussing liberal ideas and reforms, or the lack of them, and then go on to the other points. You can sort of keep coming back to it. Whatever is the case, you still have to refer to them. You should be writing at least 500 words for the essay. I would say you could probably write even 600 words. And the other key here is you have to include historical interpretations, some punchy, concise sentences in your response. Try to have at least 2 historical interpretations about liberal ideas or some other key factor that led to the outbreak of revolution in Russia. And I remind you, made the outbreak of revolution certain to happen. There were 3 revolutions in Russia, 1905, February 1917, and October 1917. So you can talk about a little bit there. And yes, 1905 is certainly a significant one. You could say the fact that there wasn't a constituent assembly, that the Tsar refused to give up any of his lawmaking powers, was a key contributing factor in 1905. Lots of things you can talk about, but going back to historical interpretations, try to include at least a couple of historical interpretations, if not more. If you can contrast and compare historical interpretations, have a paragraph or a couple of sentences like such as historian A states that liberal ideas were a key cause of the outbreak of revolution. However, historian B states that they weren't as significant a cause of the February 1917 revolution as the impact of World War I on Russian society, and then make some sort of evaluation or statement about which one of these historians' viewpoints you believe is more significant or correct, or you might say both are valid, but having some evaluation of the historians' interpretations themselves, that's pretty good, I think. So you're going to get some high marks for that. So anyway, you have to include at least a couple of historical interpretations, and back to the old rule, if you don't include historical interpretations in your essay, then the maximum you are going to get it used to be 80%, okay, out of your 100. So if we translate to your 20 marks, that's 16 marks out of 20. All right, so that's the Russian Revolution. The Chinese Revolution, I won't go on too much about this. Once again, though, you cannot just say the influence of Mao Zedong thought had very little influence on the outbreak of revolution and say, all right, that's my point about Mao Zedong thought, and then just go on to all these other factors that caused the 1949 revolution. You have to show your knowledge of Mao Zedong thought. So there's lots of different things you could refer to here. You could talk about the Hunan Report going right back to February, March 1927, where Mao talks about violence as a necessary aspect of revolution. He refers to it as not just being a dinner party or embroidery. It's an act of violence. And in doing that, he also justifies the use of violence in achieving revolutionary aims. If you understand that, that links into not only all the fighting that went on, all the battles that occurred, the encirclement campaigns at Jiangxi Soviet, or the various battles, the Shang River battle in November 1934, where the CCP was almost decimated. Looting Bridge, Laziko Pass. You could talk, that sort of idea about violence and revolution. That's not just relevant for that. That's also relevant you could say it's relevant for the struggle sessions that occurred during the thought rectification campaign at Yan'an, which began in February 1941. So there's lots there. You could talk about the mass line. You could talk about the 8 points for attention, the 3 main rules on discipline. You could quote from them. You could even talk about, if you wanted to be spiffy, you could talk about Mao. This is when Mao at Yan'an anyway comes up with his ideas about continuous revolution. The idea that you have to keep having revolutions in a society in order to avoid stagnation and corruption seeping in to society. Lots of things you can talk about here. The main point being, though, you have to at least identify and discuss some Mao Zedong thought, some Maoism, and its impact. And then you can talk about other factors as well. Okay, you could talk about Zhang Jishi's leadership. You could talk about the fact that Mao and the CCP redistributed land wherever they went along, and they gained peasant support. So there's lots of stuff there. So anyway, the list is endless. But once again, you're going to include lots of primary source evidence as well as historical interpretations. So we're looking for stats. We're looking for quotes from Mao. You could use the very, very famous Zhang Jishe quote, "Disease of the skin, disease of the soul," or it's rendered sometimes disease of the heart, where Zhang Jishe refers to the Japanese being a disease of the skin and the communists being a disease of the soul or the heart, i.e. the Japanese are easy to cure. Don't have to worry about fighting them as much as fighting the CCP. They're a lot greater problem for GMD authority within China at that time. And then the fact that because Zhang Jishe devoted so much of his time trying to fight the CCP, and not, at that point anyway, not trying to resist the Japanese encroachment in northern China, the occupation of Manchuria, and then the establishment of that northern autonomous region, not trying to stop that. And as a consequence, losing support within Chinese society because Zhang Jishe was not seen as being patriotic. Lots of different points you could talk about here. Okay, so lots there you could write about. Just make sure that you're including lots of evidence from your own knowledge. You shouldn't be, this is just asking you to use evidence to support your response. Avoid referring to sources in, I would anyway, you don't need to refer to the sources in the source booklet. You've got lots of your own knowledge. Show the examiners your own knowledge. Excite the examiners with your own knowledge and show them why you deserve very, very high marks in your essay part of the exam. All right, I think that is it. So I hope you have found my discussion of an overview of the History Revolutions 2024 end of year exam useful for your own exam this year. I wish you all the best of luck, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.